On the opening government side, we have black and yellow one from MMU. On the opening opposition, we have CAU 1. On the closing government, we have KU 2. On the closing opposition, we have HKU 1. Hero will be the chair of this round. As the panel, we have Luke, Jan, Valerie, Toshi, Keita, and Masako. So on the motion, this House believes that international law should recognize the right of each state to unilaterally undertake humanitarian intervention. We'd like to call this House to order and invite the Prime Minister to the podium.
That a lot of nations are undergoing a lot of humanitarian issues, right? Such as Syria, such as Libya. There are many other nations that are undergoing that problem, right? So what are we here to talk about? Because I'm going to talk to you about three things, right? What is the problem now when these nations have these humanitarian issues and other nations are not able to enter these nations to help these people out because of this political process and because this whole international law mechanism is mired with the political process, and why it delays these people, how it's hard for them to enter. And secondly, right, it would be dangerous because other nations can then hide behind this political process, right? Because what exactly is our stance here today? Because we believe that when it comes to humanitarian intervention, the only agenda should be the humanitarian one. It should be free of politics. It should be free of political support. It should be only for humanitarian efforts, right? So what exactly is the mechanism of international humanitarian law, right? Should any status quo is that should any nation wants to go in for humanitarian intervention, they would have to go through the UN Security Council, right? The UN Security Council would have to vote and see whether or not you can go through into that nation, right? We believe there is a problem here, right? Because of simply the veto process, right? As long as there's a particular veto against that resolution, they will not be able to enter that humanitarian process, right? Sit down. So what we believe here is that veto process is delaying these nations who want to help other nations. They're not able to enter this nation so that because of this political barrier that they're undergoing, right? So we believe that it's inherently dangerous, right? All right.
This is the obvious humanitarian crisis. Why it is so hard to get the union agreed from all the countries, United States and NATO?
Thank you for this introduction to my next point, right? What exactly does the UN actually veto particular humanitarian issues, right? We believe it's simply not that simple that, oh, because the UN sees that this is a big humanitarian problem, we'll allow people to go in, right? We believe every country in the Security Council has their own agenda. Hence why Russia and China keeps vetoing the sanctions on Syria, even though we need to provide that sanctions, right? Because these nations have the political agenda. They don't really care about everything, they don't really care, but they place more importance on their own political agenda on Syria, more so than the humanitarian people, because if they knew that the people are dying and the way to prevent Syria from killing its own people would be sanctions, why wouldn't Russia and China allow that sanctions? That's a question you need to answer, right? So exactly, that leads to my next point, right? What exactly are the flaws of the enforcement mechanism, right? Because of this political agenda, how all these countries, and basically it's all these big countries, right? Like Russia, like China, they have their own political agenda, hence why, and they have the biggest political will, especially in international communities, because of where they stand economically, because of where they stand politically, they're able to push forward their own agenda, hence preventing other nations from going into the very nations they want intervention prevention of, right? So what happens is that other smaller nations, right? Other smaller nations will not be able to enter that nation, to intervene, to help out that nation, purely because they do not have the same economical power, they don't have the same political support as Russia and China do. They do not have the seat in the UN Security Council. So what happens is that they are forced to sit idly by, and they are not able to take any positive steps towards helping these people out in the nations, especially when other nations, these nations who do not want to do anything about it, and they do not have any other form of way to go against these political nations. That's why we had a problem with the veto process. That's why we're recognizing the right for them to unilaterally go into this human intervention because of that flaw.
Okay, like I think this must be a military intervention because this is an economical sanctions US is doing now to the Cuba. So this motion should be a military intervention.
If it's about military intervention, the motion would dictate military intervention, right? But this motion clearly dictated humanitarian intervention, right? Sit down. No, you're done. But the point is, right, we agree that the status quo might be, the status quo is a problem, right? Nations still unilaterally go into other nations, right, purely for their own agenda. But what is different here is that we allow those other nations, those who are not as strong as the US, right, who unilaterally went into Iraq. We believe that now these lesser nations are able to go into other nations to help those nations, right? But let's look at the harms of this political process, right? When it is so hard to actually pass through a particular humanitarian intervention, right? What happens is that all these nations actually take a very ambiguous stance, right? The same way Arab League agrees on the sanctions, but doesn't really like they don't really put a political stance, right? This is how these other nations who could really make a difference actually hide behind this because of this political process. They tell you, oh, we're not going to support this anyway. We're not going to vote on this issue anyway because we're not on the UN Security Council. We're not going to make a difference. So why exactly are we going to vote? So all what these nations do is that they hide behind this political ambiguity so that they don't have to do anything about these nations. So what exactly does this right recognize, right? Because what they tell you now is that, oh, sorry, we don't have the right to intervene into that nation, so we're not going to do so. So when you allow this right to these nations to actually enter these nations, sit down. What you do is that you force them to take a stance, right? You force them to take a position. And more importantly, you force them to do something about it. Because then you can tell the Arab League, you can't just sit idly by while Syria kills its own people, while Libya kills its own people. You have to take a stance because now the right is already there, right? You can't just simply go on and tell about people, the political process is just too long, it's just too ridiculous, so we're not going to do anything about it, right? Sit down. So, and then more importantly, right, we believe that there are already safeguards to this issue, right? We don't believe that any country would just simply go into to another country purely for their own agenda, right? Because we believe that if you commit a particular war crime in that country, we believe there are already safeguards, there are already checks and balances to ensure should you abuse this right that we're granting you. We believe that the international humanitarian law and war crimes legislation would actually control these countries from actually abusing this right that we're granting them, right? So what exactly are we telling you today, Madam Speaker? There is a problem when nations want to help out other nations, but purely because they don't have the economical power to do so, they don't have the political will to do so, they are not able to do because of this political process, right? So what we're trying to do here today as government is we recognize there's a problem. We want to help these nations. We want to help these nations that have these humanitarian problems. Hence why we're going with side government.
We thank the Prime Minister. Let's have the Leader of Opposition.
Madam Chair and ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not simply about including all the sanction, all forms of the sanction, like economic sanction or military sanction, whatever. We think that if that is the case, Madam Chair, we are talking about the status quo. We don't see any of the clarification is happening in this round. First, I wanted to clarify what this debate is initially talking about. We think that economic sanction is not the main mean or the main solution they have to bring in this debate. Then, if the USA is doing the Cuba economic sanction and why the EU is not buying oil from Syria, we think that kind of things is already happening in the status quo. We think that is their proving is not actually a very big standard they're bringing. But secondly, even if that is true. We think that like if you bring about the economic sanction, then you have to make it other countries do also the unilateral action. Like Iran, if the China or the Russia is supporting them and like economic benefit profit is continuously given them, their solution cannot be stand. We think that their recognition of the problem and the solution, there's a huge gap anyway. So this debate should be more about like why the unilateral action, like unilateral like enforcement mechanism of the intervention should be the main issue on this debate. No. And secondly, we think that she's talked about like there is some obvious harms like the human violation value, like a genocide, etc. We think that that is not the simple just case we can actually talking about. We think that that is actually so much obvious that every nation has to agree upon it, then we think that that is actually maybe general consensus will be successfully made in this case. But the more complicated issue is that when the human value violation is very, like the interpreting is very complicated, like the degree of the dictatorship, how the other nations see whether that action is a human right violation or not is different. And then how that kind of definition of the human value will be very complicated at the end. We think that I'm going to talk about why the human value is very important to get many other different perspective interpretation in my argument further elaborately. And thirdly, she talked about it's very hard to make a consensus, hard to make a process at the end. Yes, that's because the interpretation of the human value is very different dependent on other nations, and also it's actually violation of the nation's sovereignty. So you cannot invade with the very ambiguous, simple standard, which is just given by one nation. We think that that's not justified at the end. No. That's firstly, she talked about check and balance will be happen, and how we couldn't hear any of the evidence how under her model the check and balance will be happen. When the one nation just simply define what is the human value and just go in that nation and invade the nation and sweep the nation, how that kind of check and balance will be happen in the status quo. We think that there is no problem solution yet. We don't see any of the clarification from the opening government. I'm very sorry for you. So firstly, I'm going to talk about why we need the general consensus in the first place. And secondly, I'm going to prove you the harms in general.
I think everybody agrees that what's happening in Syria is abhorrent and it's killing everyone. I think the value of human life is normal, is accepted, right? Tell us why exactly people can't go and help, especially since Russia and China are against the sanctions.
Yeah, that will be explained in my argument. So why do we need a general consensus from the first place? We think that can be the good intention or the bad intention. I'm going to analyze it in that level. First, we think that we are not talking about just very obvious issue that everyone can agree upon it. Like if the genocide is happening, then we think that other nation will see the genocide is bad, then they will make a consensus quite easily. But secondly, the main issue is that when we cannot be sure whether the oppressive government is actually directly against for the human value in the nation, when the other nation is not quite sure whether there is a clear standard that we can have to invade one nation, then that is a very tricky question we have to talk about. When the degree of the dictatorship is not directly linked to the direct human value in the nation, we think that is why we need various other nation opinion, various other people's perspective to approach that idea, whether there is a direct human value, whether that is actually direct harm to the nation, whether that is what that government citizens want to bring the change. That kind of interpretation can be happen with a general consensus, with other nations' interpretation at the end. No. And thirdly, the reason why we have very difficult and more complicated process is that because other nations define the human value in a different way. Maybe the China's standard of defining what is the human value violation and between the USA seeing what is the direct violation of the human value really quite different. Then they have to make a consensus because they have to present the clear idea, clear standard when they just invade one nation and disrupt the nation's government structure, etc. We think that is actually nation sovereignty at the end. No. Then secondly, there is a very high possibility that one nation can bring the bad intention to invade the nation. So, for example, even if they in a superficial level, they think about, is it actually about human value protection, the purpose can be behind like more pursuing the oil, pursuing their own interest. We think that is very changing the characteristic of the invasion. We think that is actually why we need a clear standard. Then secondly, what is the harm? We think that when USA swept away the Somalia, we think that USA actually, first they swept all the nations, but suddenly they ran out of the money and they just had to go out from the nation. Why? Because every nation is suffered with economic crisis. And when the war or the result of the invention is actually very huge. One nation cannot handle that so simply. Then it's very hard to get another people's consensus at the end because they think this actually result will be goes on to one nation. We think that is not happen. But thirdly, it's very hard to get the agreements of the neighboring nation when the new government is set by the Western nation. This happened in Iraq when the USA just simply go in the nation and set up the government by Western idea. Then the Arab League and the other neighboring Arab nations couldn't get agreed that government is legitimate, and they couldn't get any cooperative aids from other neighboring nations. That's why I'm very proud to oppose.
Let's have the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the opening government's case.
Madam Chair, was obvious when Gaddafi was killing his own people. Madam Chair, China blocked NATO from intervening. Madam Chair, and while they blocked them, even though eventually they agreed, people were still dying. Madam Chair, it was obvious when Robert Mugabe was killing his own people in Zimbabwe and China still blocked people from intervening. It's obvious that people are dying in Syria, Madam Chair, but still Russia blocked any action from being taken, Madam Chair, because what we fundamentally tell you in our case is that when it comes to humanitarian intervention, the only agenda should be the humanitarian one, and we believe fundamentally the mechanism of international humanitarian law and international humanitarian intervention is based on the veto process of the Security Council, and we believe the Security Council curbs people who want to take action from taking action, Mrs. Speaker. So we believe fundamentally that's the question they have to ask and tell us, how exactly are we going to give an opportunity for those people who want to take action, and how are you going to stop the deaths of those people while you're still reaching this consensus, Mr. Speaker. I'm fundamentally going to tell you two things. Sit down. The first thing I'm going to tell you how to put the fear of God into evil men, Mr. Speaker. And second, I want to tell you how it will strengthen international humanitarian law and the institutions that represent it. But before I go on, let's deal with the attacks we got from side opposition. Sir. Because the first thing they told us is that when it comes to humanitarian intervention, it's obvious and we do stuff. Sit down. It's not so obvious. It's not as easy as them saying it's obvious that we see people dying and things get done. They don't, because the very essence, the very mechanism of international humanitarian human law is that you have to ask the Security Council, you have to ask the Security Council to do something. It was obvious when people were dying in Rwanda, but because Britain and France refused to intervene, the United States refused to support the action to intervene, we never got that, and we believe that standing in people's way of people who want to take action, we believe is fundamentally flawed and we should be removed because the only agenda should be the humanitarian one. And second of all, Madam Chair, they try to assert, the only thing they try to assert and the only benefit of status quo is that it gives a general consensus. We don't necessarily believe that there's a general consensus, Madam Chair, because fundamentally we have two problems with the general consensus. One is that it takes, sit down guys, one is that it takes a lot of time, Madam Chair, and with these humanitarian interventions, while they're taking time, people are dying. While they were still taking time coming to a general consensus, Madam Chair, Gaddafi was bombing his own people with fighter aircraft, Madam Chair. They didn't account for those plans, Madam Chair. They still haven't explain to us exactly why is it important we have that general consensus, even if it was there? Because fundamentally, this is my second level of rebuttal. We don't believe general consensus is there, because even if we agree that people are dying, we believe different nations within the Security Council have their own political agenda. Something my first speaker brought up and they totally ignored, on how China has deals with al-Bashir in Sudan, has oil deals with Sudan, and how Russia is selling weapons to Syria, and how China is selling weapons to Zimbabwe, and they will never allow the intervention, because as soon as they allow this intervention, the economic agendas are compromised because they want these evil men there, because they sell to them, because we believe that general consensus will never be reached. But more importantly, they stated the question of check and balances. Madam Chair, this debate, sit down guys, I'll take you after the rebuttals. Madam Chair, this debate, when we talk about general consensus, we accept this is a real concern, Madam Chair. But first of all, we have two rebuttals to this. The first rebuttal, we don't necessarily see how that's different from status quo, because we believe in status quo. A nation, if it wants to invades. We saw Russia invading South Ossetia, we saw America invading Iraq in this instance. They were never there to stop them, Madam Chair. This debate is not about the bad guys. We believe fundamentally this debate is about the good guys, Madam Chair, because the good guys who espouse to international humanitarian law are blocked because they have to follow the mechanism of going to the Security Council and listen to the Security Council. And the Security Council says no because of their separate political agendas. They can't do anything about it, Madam Chair. That's what this debate is about. And even more so, if they wanted a check and balance, we believe there already existing mechanisms such as we will hold you account to your war crimes, Madam Chair. If you go there and you make the situation worse, if you break it, you have to fix it. That's within the mechanism of the law that, Madam Chair, if you destroy the infrastructure within that individual place, you have to fix it the same way America had to stay and make sure that before they left Iraq that it was fixed, Madam Chair. So they have to show us the clear distinction from status quo, because we believe that the distinction, Madam Chair, is that the good guys can't do anything. Before I get to my sentence, quick.
Okay, Syria, obvious, right? Syria has killed their people, 3,000 people. China killed more than 3,000 in their country, and Russia killed more 3,000 in Chechnya, Georgia. I don't humanitarian interview in China and Russia.
Madam Chair, yes, maybe we may not be able to intervene in China and Russia, Madam Chair, but we can't intervene in situations like Zimbabwe, Madam Chair. We couldn't intervene in situations like Rwanda, Madam Chair. Could they please tell us how we're going to circumvent this process where we have to listen to different political agendas, where the humanitarian agenda is superseded by the differing agendas of different individuals, Madam Chair, where the good guy who wants to do something is stopped from doing something. Because here's the inherent harm that we believe. Because we believe, Madam Chair, will put the fear of God into evil men, Madam Chair. Because if Mohammed Gaddafi and on al-Assad in this instance knows that America has the power to intervene, and they have the intent and they want to, Madam Chair, and they don't have to go through the process, and Syria doesn't have the protection of Russia in the Security Council, Madam Chair, then they know that action will be taken against them. But right now, evil leaders know that all they have to do to get away from humanitarian intervention is make a few powerful friends in the UN, and make sure they have a few economic interests with people who control the mechanism of international humanitarian law, and then there won't be any intervention. And we believe this is a fundamentally negative message to send, and fundamentally dangerous message to send, Madam Chair. It's contradictory to the human intervention and protecting the humans. And even more so, we believe that, on my second point, it will strengthen international humanitarian law, because we believe if we go down this slippery slope, the humanitarian law becomes secondary when it comes to the thoughts of the international community. And we believe the very institutions such as the ICC, which people view as a joke, Madam Chair, view as a colonialism tool, those views will be perpetuated. Why will they be perpetuated? Because people say, no, you have your own economic agenda. You only intervene when it suits your agenda. There is no human intervention purely on the sake of the humanitarian purpose, Madam Chair. And we believe if we stick with status quo where you have to go through this political mechanism, Madam Chair, we'll see these very institutions losing their legitimacy. And if you lose these sort of institutions, such as the ICC, Madam Chair, then we have no hope for international humanitarian law, and we have no hope for saving these very people we want to protect. So at the end of the day, they have to show us what is the intrinsic benefit to status quo that we should not accept this policy of unilateralism.
Thank you. Let's invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Madam Chair, as you guys recognize now, The opening government first because it was non-contentious in today's debate.
You're here.
We just proposed status quo. Like we said, U.S. sanction Cuba and EU sanction Syria. This is not debate about that economic sanction. This debate must be about military intervention.
You're here.
But like we said, even if that is true, I think there is a poor position, right? Because economic sanction can be easily weaken other country trade with you. Like the Iran case, China and Russia. Like the case of Myanmar, like Korea and China is backing up their countries. That is why economic sanction cannot solve any problems. I think this is the problem. But I think second speaker trying to engage with us military intervention. That is what I can say about the military intervention, right? The only harm second speaker talked about was it takes too much time. But we say it is a good thing because arbitrary line, the taking short time, making bad ideas. I asked them a POI, Syria, China, and Russia. There is no obvious line. Like my first speaker clearly said, if there is obvious humanitarian crisis, you can get consensus. Like a NATO go to Libya. Not to get a consensus from the four main countries, Arab League, right? Qatar, United Jordan, United Arab Emirates, all the countries access. You can come to this country. That is why Libyan case was so successful. My first speaker clearly said, if you go to their military intervention, it can be short-term policy. U.S. intervention in Somalia is perfectly fair. Why? Just because it costs too much money. In the context of economic crisis, if you go to some other countries, you can't solve the problem right now. You must get out from that country. The best example is Somalia. You can solve nothing. But even if you do something, the post-conflict rebuilding costs too much money too. And you need consensus from outside of that neighboring countries. Nothing can achieve in these guys' matters, right? Then they talked about, second speaker talked about, look, we want to put fear of other countries. And there's a bad guy, right? America and other countries. I think you guys legitimize that Russia and US, right? Because Russia and US said, even if you guys, there is no consensus, I don't care. Russia can go to Georgia. Russia can go to Chechnya. China can go to Tibet. Those kind of ideas legitimize these countries. I think that is bad idea. And she already said something about that, right? When you just say you can decide yourself because humanitarian intervention cannot be obvious at the first place, then you can use the humanitarian political regions. You can use the humanitarian crisis as economical region, like the case of Iran. I think that is the problem. Closing. Closing.
So why you're making such a consensus? People in Darfur has been dying, and people in Rwanda has been dying. If there is no consensus to be made to act and stop the genocide and mass killings, Madam Speaker.
Because we say even if you just go to that countries and stop the war, you can't make that country perfect. We give you the ideas for Somalia because you can build a country on your hand. If you go there, all the countries and every countries, there's a lot of fund from other countries, and your government can be recognized neighboring countries. I think that is a legitimate. I think that is a justification. If that's obviously bad, people are going to say I can be there, like the case of Libya. If you guys say you can't get any consensus, you must defend Libya. I think closing government, you must defend. Why in the case of Libya, is it possible to have the consensus about intervention? That is the thing I expect in today's debate. Then their second speaker also talked about there is a checks and balance. No, you just giving the power to the countries decide themselves. Nobody say your action is bad because motion itself said you can go there by your decision. And he also talked about it gives and power to the international consensus. No, international law and intervention is powerful in terms of when all the countries agreed because it erase all the argument against that humanitarian intervention. Because you just go other countries, decide by yourself, that detail have a lot of argument. This is Western invasion. This is just killing my people. This is just killing my tribes. Those kind of argument is backed up by you guys. No. And moving on to my first argument, why their policy consolidate oppositions, right? I think these guys can bring the oppositions. If you go to some countries, it's not just about all the country say welcome Western power. This is not the case. When you go to Libya, there's a lot of tribes, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of families, and dictators easily use this because you can see a lot of controversy outside of the country. When they see the BBC and CNN, they see this is a controversial intervention. That is why they can easily describe. That is why they can easily torture. This is just killing my people. That is why your policy cannot solve the problem. Then your policy come back against Somalia. You don't solve the problem, you just ruin the countries living in non-government crisis like the case of Somalia. I think that is the problem. Next argument, undermine international intervention. Like I said, international consensus is really important, right? Because all the people say, you are bad guy, that is why I want to go there and save your people. This must be a precondition of all the intervention, because this is the big issue. The country's national sovereignty is the big issue. This is not just you go like the supermarket and buying the snack. This is about, you just analyze, you talk to the people, you announce the people. These government dictators making a bad. That is why your sovereignty cannot be saved in today's debate. These kind of ideas must have a social consensus and international consensus. But these guys undermine international consensus like the UN, because UN does not have a power anymore. Even if one country using bad ideas, UN cannot say you must stop. UN cannot deter this movement. UN is nothing right now. And after that, even if there is a consensus, they try humanitarian intervention. Dictators can use the argument. Look, other countries, US just go there stealing their oil. UN is nothing. They don't have any power. When my neighbor country tortured, tear apart, attacked by other country, UN doing nothing. That is why all your argument undermine one big entity, UN, in really bad way. I think that is the problems of government team. I strongly expect closing government will engage with our point. Madam Chair, what have I told you today? This is not just about snacks and going to the supermarket. This must be about hard choices. This must be about difficult decisions, right? When you have a difficult decision, you must have a general consensus. There's an arbitrary line. I can go to countries, I can attack their countries, ruin their countries. It is countervailing, like the case of Somalia. No engagement whatsoever. We believe your policy undermine everything. You believe the country intervention is going to be ruined. That is why I'm strongly opposed to this motion.